Well, this might be a little bit painful. Fred Zinnemann is my favorite American director, and on the surface, Behold a Pale Horse seems like it should be another one of his triumphs. It was made in 1964, only 5 years after he made The Nun Story, which is one of my top 2 movies of all time, basically. 2 years later, he would make A Man for All Seasons, which is an excellent film, and along with High Noon, probably Fred Zinnemann's most well-known movie, particularly for modern audiences. Behold a Pale Horse stars Gregory Peck, Anthony Quinn, and Omar Sharif, 3 fantastic actors all in their prime. And the film was based on a book by none other than Emmerich Pressburger, who, along with Michael Powell, had directed a slew of great British films in the 30s, well, in the 40s and 50s. There's The Archers, movies like The Red Shoes, A Matter of Life and Death / Stairway to Heaven, Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, things like this. The film centers around an aging guerrilla fighter in Francoist Spain, actually exiled from Spain, living in France. And it seems like this would set up Zinnemann's trademark moral dilemmas and tough decisions. So this all sounds very promising, but Behold the Pale Horse is a film that Zinnemann himself said never really came together. It's rated 6.7 on IMDb with about 2,000 votes. Not very well reviewed or widely known. So what went wrong? Well, to be honest, that is a bit of a setup. A vague attempt at making this movie sound like something that you should continue watching, making this video, this review right here, be something that you should keep your eyeballs on. One of the biggest risks in reviewing things, I think, is that the narrative of the review comes before anything else. In other words, that people start with the clickbait and then build the review from there. This is not a recipe for nuanced analysis, but on platforms like YouTube, it's hard to avoid doing this, especially if you want your audience to grow, and who doesn't want that? Even if you want to make nuanced content, surely you want more people to see that. The last few videos on this channel have gotten a few more views than usual. Don't worry, I'm taking us right back down to the sewers of obscurity. It'll be an interesting ride, and we will do the movies justice, even if it doesn't make for the most snappy clickbait titles. Although I can probably still think of something weird to put in the thumbnail. Behold the Pale Horse is not a bad movie. I don't want to set it up as like some dramatic thing, some big downfall or anything like that. I can understand why Fred Zinnemann said it didn't really come together, but it's not because there were any dramatic fallouts on set. It's not because there are any crazy twists of the production or any wild, bizarre choices that were made. I'll touch on a few reasons why I don't think it was successful. There's maybe 5 reasons. They're interesting reasons. We'll get to them. But first, what's the movie about? Well, the 3 main actors play 3 different characters, as is often the case. There's Artigas, Vignolas, and Francisco. So Artigas is Gregory Peck. This is a guerrilla fighter who has been exiled to France, like I mentioned. Vignolas is the captain of the Guardia Civil in a town called Saint Martin. Artigas lives in Pau in France, by the way, which is not too far from the border. And then finally, Francisco is a priest in Saint Martin as well. It's worth noting that part of Franco's fascist ideology in Spain was national Catholicism. And so some of the guerrillas, some of the exiles, some of the Spanish exiles in France tend to be quite anti-Catholic. The movie begins with these exiles leaving Spain in 1939, with Franco having taken power with them, essentially having lost the war. They head across the border, turn in their weapons, and leave. I guess they were given a chance to do this. We start with newsreel footage, actually, and there's a nice transition from newsreel footage to the real footage, real meaning not real in this case, since it's a movie, but the footage with Gregory Peck. We have sort of a trademark Fred Zinnemann shot as he tracks along this long column of people. We see this a lot in the Nun Story too, tracking along the columns of nuns in the convent, tracking along this long column of people waiting to leave Spain. Eventually, Gregory Peck steps up to the front of the line, and he's about to hand over his rifle, but he changes his mind and he runs back into Spain, only to be stopped by his friends. But you get the idea. Here's a guy who doesn't want to give up, who has not given up the fight. Really nice, succinct way to start out the movie, I think. We then skip forward in time by about 20 years, and we meet a young child named Paco. And here we come to the first problem with the movie. Not that the guy who plays Paco, I forget his name, was bad, but child actors are tough. And even, it's interesting. I mean, there's maybe two reasons. There's a lot of different reasons why child actors can be problematic. One of the reasons is that sometimes they're just bad actors. This is very often the case. This guy is decent. He's in a couple of other movies. This was his last film. I think he's still alive, but it's not clear what he went on to do with the rest of his life. Be interesting to know. But even when child actors are good, sometimes there's a problem, which is just that sometimes children aren't great dramatic engines for a film. Sometimes they aren't exactly relatable. Sometimes they don't fit into serious material or something. But like I said, this guy's not bad, but Paco doesn't do a great job setting up the film exactly, especially given all of the huge titans, all the great actors in this movie. You start out wondering, why are we following around this kid? It turns out that Paco's father was killed by Vignolas and was a friend of Artigas. So Paco, an orphan now, by the way. Another Fred Zinnemann little thing here is the film The Search is also about an orphan, so Fred Zinnemann had some experience there. The child acting in that film works a lot better, and I think there's something to think about there in terms of like The Search being about a child stuck in Europe after World War II. Also, of course, Fred Zinnemann, born in Poland, lots of his movies are interested in Europe. He actually went to Spain to research this film along with Alexander Trauner, the guy who did the production design, who also did the production design for The Nun Story, who had to replicate for The Nun Story all of the convent interiors because they were not allowed to film in the real convents in Belgium, so they replicated them in France. Anyway, Trauner and Zinnemann went to Spain. It's not like there was not preparation for this movie. Zinnemann was, as usual, very particular about the preparations for this film. He discusses this a little bit in his autobiography, which I have sitting over there. Had to pull some strings to get into Spain, of course, which was still controlled by Franco at the time, and the movie itself is filmed in France, not in Spain. Anyway, there's a difference between The Search, which is really centered around this, like, one of the sort of dynamos of the film is the empathy we feel towards this orphan whose parents were killed in World War II. By the way, both of Fred Zinnemann's parents killed in the Holocaust. That connection feels a lot stronger than in this movie, where you spend a little bit of time wondering why Paco is the centerpiece of the movie in the beginning. It takes us a while to get to the good actors. Paco eventually finds his way to Poe. He meets up with some other random guy who doesn't seem particularly significant to the story. And then he eventually finds Peck. He finds Artigas, Gregory Peck, who it turns out is a bit old and grumpy. Now, Paco, being young, a bit idealistic, as an 8-year-old or whatever, wants Artigas to come back and avenge his father's death. That's the promise that he made. At first, this seems very unlikely. Artigas is done with his raiding days. It seems like he just wants to sit around, basically. But then Artigas learns that his mother is, who's in San Martin, is on the verge of death. Vignolas, who we meet as well, also is aware of this and sees this as his opportunity to finally, after 20 years, capture Artigas. This is really the main dynamic of the movie. Vignolas trying to spring this trap. Artigas trying to decide if he wants to go back and how. It does take some time and messing around for us to get to this part of the movie, but this is really the crux of the film. We see a bit of both sides of the story, which reminds me some of the later Fred Zinnemann film, The Day of the Jackal, right, where we see the jackal and also the police trying to, well, I won't get into what, I won't try to spoil the movie, but it reminds me of that. Or possibly it might remind you of Heat a little bit, although that's quite a different thing entirely. Some of the elements in Vignola's plotline feel a little bit useless. There are some characters here and there in this movie that you just wonder why are these characters in the movie. But for the most part, this plotline is actually strong. Two strong actors. Maybe the characters could be a little bit more nuanced, but decent characters, and plenty of suspense. We have some moral ambiguity when it comes to both of these characters. Gregory Peck, is probably known to modern audiences primarily for having played Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. Obviously, he had a long and storied career, but that's probably his most famous role, and partly because of this, also because of some other movies, I think a lot of people think of him as an upstanding guy. He was to some extent typecast as this moral guy, a moral compass. a moral leader, something like that. But not all Gregory Peck films are like that, and sometimes it's weird to watch Gregory Peck films where he is not the moral guy, where he does something that's not exactly what you'd expect. And this movie falls in that category. And this, by the way, is potentially reason number 2 why the movie didn't hit it off so well, because Gregory Peck is not Mr. Morality. Instead, he's grumpy. He can be short. He can be violent. There's a couple of weird scenes with women in this film. There's a scene early on with a maid, it seems like, that he wants to sleep with him, I guess. There's a really kind of baffling scene towards the end of the movie with a barmaid that I'm not really even sure what is going on in this scene, but there's just some weird, bizarre, I guess, sexual tension between him and this barmaid for seemingly no reason at all. Maybe something was cut out of the movie there. I really, kind of baffling. He's also vehemently anti-Catholic. I mean, like I said, makes sense that the guerrillas are anti-Catholic because it had national Catholicism under Franco. You don't need to know anything about Spain to know this. It's pretty obvious that the guerrillas don't like Catholics because they're allied with Franco just from the movie. But this is potentially reason number 3 why the movie may not have actually hit it off that well with audiences at the time. These days, it's a little bit hard for me to imagine a movie being unsuccessful because it's anti-Catholic, but in the old days, this is extremely plausible. And in fact, before the 60s, when we still had the production code, the Catholic interest in Hollywood was immense. And Catholics kind of ran the show in terms of what could or could not be put on screen, what could or could not be shown to a wide audience in theaters. The Nun Story is a very interesting movie and an interesting book because it, in general, appealed both to Catholics and non-Catholics alike. Well, let me say this. Religious people and non-religious people, both. The book was like this, book written by Catherine Hilm. The book was on the Catholic national reading list and things. It was well reviewed by tons of leading sort of Catholic scholars, priests, and things. There's a magazine called America, which was a magazine for, I forget the sect, but some branch of Catholicism that was really championed the book. There were some Catholics who were worried about it, that thought it painted things in a really negative light. But for the most part, it appealed to a very broad audience. And the movie was the same thing, where if you've seen The Nun Story, you know why it's not exactly all flowers and sunshine. Being a nun is revealed in this. And so you might think on the surface that some Catholics wouldn't like that they'd be worried that it would dissuade people from becoming nuns. But in fact, it was quite a popular movie with Catholics and anti-Catholics, and extremely subtle. Anyway, nuanced movie, like I said, basically my all-time favorite movie. So, incredible movie. Like I said, straddled this Catholicism thing. This movie is actually quite similar in some ways, in that the film itself is not anti-Catholic, and Omar Sharif's character, Francisco, gives a pretty interesting and subtle view of a priest operating in a fascist country, where you have national Catholicism, but you also have priests who are beholden to some higher spiritual laws. How do you reconcile these things? Now, this movie is not anywhere near as complex or subtle as The Nun Story, unfortunately. And these things are not explored anywhere near as deeply as they could be, but they are in there, and there are some compelling moments, especially because the movie is pretty suspenseful. The stakes seem relatively high at times, and so they do kind of turn up the pressure on some of these philosophical, moral ideas. Anyway, point is, Gregory Peck, Artigas, he is vehemently anti-Catholic, but the film, well, I don't know that it is anti-Catholic. In fact, I don't think it is. The title of the film, Behold the Pale Horse, is a quotation from the Bible, referring to the horse that death rides, I think, being very pale. And here, I think that's almost certainly referring to Franco and Vignolas as death on this pale horse, or maybe Vignolas is the horse and Franco's the... Anyway, you get the idea. Nonetheless, it's conceivable that Catholics at the time would have been put off by Peck's character, especially in combination with Peck sort of playing not Mr. Moral like he usually does, but instead playing this anti-Catholic guy. Maybe people didn't like that. Okay. Anthony Quinn originally wanted to play Artigas, But Fred Zinnemann thought that it would be too obvious. This is pretty interesting because, like I said, Gregory Peck's casting is a little bit against type. The character Fred Zinnemann thought would be too obvious if Anthony Quinn had played him. Now Anthony Quinn ends up playing Vignolas, who's an interesting character. Like I said, maybe not as strong as he could be, but there are some moments there. He's a bad guy, but he has some principles. There's a interesting moment of prayer where he's sort of bargaining with God. There's early on in the film, he accepts essentially a bribe, and he says, "Okay, God, I'll give you back the bribe if you can give me Artigas." So immoral, a scoundrel, but to some extent self-aware. That's another interesting question to ask about people who are lackeys in fascist governments, right? Scoundrels, but to some extent self-aware. Does that make it better or worse? I don't know. So, like I said, there is some moral ambiguity in the characters. It could be more. That said, this film has tough decisions. That's probably one of the highlights of it. There are some tough decisions made by a bunch of different characters, by Francisco, by Paco, by Artigas, a lot of different characters making tough decisions. Nobody does tough decisions better than Fred Zinnemann. This is really the hallmark of his film, taking taking morally oriented people and turning the screws on them, giving them hard choices to make that test their internal values and that don't have obvious answers, right? Uncertainty, of course. The classic Fred Zinnemann tough decision is not one that is resolved. You won't know after the film ends if it's the right decision. And this movie, in some decisions, that's not the case. But for other decisions, that is true. You do not know if the right choice was made after the movie ended. Like I said, fairly exciting movie, quite watchable for major portions, especially the middle third. The last third, the ending, is a little bit underwhelming, and the reason is basically because this movie stuck a little bit between being kind of a morality tale and being more of an action movie, right? And this takes us to the fourth reason why I think the movie maybe didn't catch on, and this is the most subtle reason by far. I've mentioned The Day of the Jackal already. This is a later Fred Zinnemann movie that... Gotta sneeze. There we go. We'll see if that happens again. It might. Later Fred Zinnemann movie that doesn't really have too many of the hallmark Fred Zinnemann moral things in it. It's really kind of a police procedural film more than anything. But that's a movie that fit in really well with kind of the 1970s vibe. That's a movie that I think probably felt quite contemporary. Reminded me some of like something like the movie Z. Feels really new, feels really modern. Fred Zinnemann also has older movies, like The Nun Story, like High Noon, things that are much more on the morality play side of things. Now, like I said, Fred Zinnemann's films are not the classic sort of didactic morality play that you might have in a lot of 40s and 50s films. They're movies with true uncertainty that I think expose profound questions about life. But this movie is a little bit caught between those two things. It's also a little bit caught more in sort of a generic classic era. There's a little bit of this that's just kind of suspense story, kind of a mechanical, clockwork of movies where things are all sort of headed one direction, then something changes and you realize this changes all these other things. A little bit confused. You'll notice I said also this movie comes out 2 years before A Man for All Seasons, but A Man for All Seasons is a completely different movie than this movie. Completely different movie. And the difference between 1964 and 1966 might seem like only a couple years, but really undergoing a sea change in Hollywood at that time between classic cinema, which was heading out, and modern cinema, which was coming in. A Man for All Seasons is really refined, very novelesque. Something like some refined play, like some sort of Shakespearean play, centering on a man's facing a moral question. It has none of this like classic mechanical nature to it at all, which is something that maybe High Noon is maybe one of the peak sort of mechanical films for Fred Zinnemann's career. Anyway, I think you get the idea. This movie is caught between a couple of different modes here, and it ends up being just a little bit illegible because of that. The ending in particular seems a little bit underwhelming because of that. Like I said, the movie's kind of set up as a suspense movie. The ending is a little bit more of this sort of moral quandary type of ending to some extent. and it maybe isn't that satisfying for some people. So I can understand why you might be a bit let down. A couple other miscellaneous things. The accents in this movie are a little bit all over the place. The movie is in English, obviously. The French in the film is in French, which I think is a nice touch because, for instance, when Paco goes to France, he's really disoriented. He's leaving his home country. He's trying to find Artigas in this foreign country he doesn't speak the language in, and so it makes a lot of sense that when he gets there, it's in French, and so the audience feels the alienation along with him. Okay, cool. The accents, like I said, though, a little bit goofy here and there. Most people try to speak with sort of a Spanish accent, except Gregory Peck, who makes no attempt whatsoever, which maybe is good. I don't know. Maurice Jarre did the music for this movie. The music is pretty good, but it occasionally leans a little bit onto the almost like goofy side of things, a little bit, almost a playful side of things. This is a serious movie, but occasionally the music has a couple of playful motifs here and there that didn't quite do it for me. The other thing about this movie, reason number 5, I mentioned this already, but this is a black and white movie. 1964 is a little bit late to try and make a black and white movie. It doesn't mean it's impossible, and there are black and white movies coming out all the time, but the odds are stacked a little bit against you. Even, honestly, again, 2 years earlier, and things are completely different. You have, Judgment at Nuremberg coming out. In the early 60s, you have a lot of serious social problem films coming out in the early 60s that are black and white, serious black and white movies. By 1964, we're starting to come to the tail end of this a little bit. Audiences are maybe not expecting this as much. And again, this movie doesn't quite go all in on that sort of serious social realism thing. It's still caught between being a couple of different things. It tries to do a little bit of sort of action-y stuff in a little way. In a couple ways, it's almost noir-esque. It's caught between a couple of different things, and so the black and white kind of works against it. I'd also say that I honestly think the black and white cinematography in this movie actually doesn't look very good. There are some nice shots in it here and there, but a lot of it is very dark. Like I said, almost looking kind of like a noir at times. Very dark cinematography. I don't think is as strong as it could be. One of the worst looking Fred Zinnemann films out there, to be honest. So that's Behold a Pale Horse. Like I said, I don't want to try and cram it into some little box. This is a pretty good movie. Like I said, the middle third of it, very watchable. It has some of the hallmark Zinnemann tough decisions that are quite nice. It has some good acting here and there. At the same time, it has issues. Not glaring issues, but yeah, not a stunningly good movie. But hey, if you're into Fred Zinnemann, like I am, I wouldn't put off watching this movie like I did. I thought, oh no, it's rated 6.7, can't do that. No, if you like Fred Zinnemann, you'll probably like this movie. You might as well check it out.